lots of our age groups are big. So you'll have 5 to 9s in one. Avenue is probably slightly unusual.
So there's quite a difference between a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old.
Yes, yeah. And people will think, well, the 9-year-olds at least know how to sit and behave, but the 5-year-olds will lose focus if I don't keep them engaged. And so we teach, I think, unhelpfully to the younger end, when actually we need to be teaching to the older end and kind of dragging the littlies along with us. And Piper has a lovely saying, which is, give kids big truths to grow into rather than little truths to grow out of.
Hello and welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. My name is Adrian Reynolds. I'm the head of national ministries for the FIEC. Thanks for joining us. And I'm joined today by Mel Lacy, who works for Growing Young Disciples. Hello again, Mel. Nice to have you with us.
Hey, Adrian. Thanks very much.
And Joel Murray, who's our communications officer, manager, guru, Supremo. What's your proper job title, Joel?
Communications and Media Officer.
There we go.
Comms guy is fine.
Comms guy, yeah. That means he looks after the phones, stuff like that. And
everything apart from the phones, actually.
Everything apart from the phones. We're very rude about him. Thanks so much for joining us. And the reason Joel's with us, actually, is we talk a little bit more about youth and children's ministry. Is last Sunday, Joel, you led your first Sunday school class. Is that right?
It was very exciting.
Just tell us how it went.
I loved it. We played with a parachute, a really big parachute.
Did you? Yeah,
that was fun. We all got little bits of string, answering questions and strings and stuff. And then,
what do you mean answering questions with string?
Answer a question, you pick a string at blind, and it could be long or medium, and there's 2 teams, and then you tie them all together. Who wins?
Good game.
The tension was palpable. And we talked about...
Sounds like an FIC staff meeting, that does it.
We'll try next week. We talked about the rich man and his party, and he invited the people and they had excuses.
Yes.
And then he invited the lonely and the outcasts in. And then, I led a group of 8 to 11s.
Great.
And we talked about that. What distracts them from Jesus and all that kind of stuff. What good things distract.
So you're our kind of target. You're our target man.
Yes.
Because today we're talking about raising up and training children's and youth workers. If I don't get the terminology exactly right, forgive me. I'm sort of talking about that sort of breadth of people who work with under 18s, essentially, starting from 0
0 to 18,
all the way up to 18. I guess, Mel, one of the things that happens in churches is, especially if you're of a church of a certain size, you kind of have the money and you set aside perhaps someone to do youth and children's ministry. Leaders can kind of think, that's job done. That's often the way it tends to look in a church, certainly looking at it from the outside. Is that just a caricature, or is it actually a reality?
No, I think that is a reality. A question that I asked some of the guys that I'm training at the moment recently was, does your youth and children's ministry, although it's part of your church, effectively run like a parachurch ministry? And I think sometimes that's what happens when you get kind of effective kids work set up, effective youth work set up, and it just kind of ticks over, but it's not really part of the church family or the vision of what the church is about. Classically, it's been described as a one-eared Mickey Mouse. So you've got
you're going to have to explain that.
Well, yes. So you've got the church in the middle, which is Mickey Mouse's face, and then you've got the ear, which is the youth ministry kind of tacked on the edge, and very much kind of as an outside part of what we're doing. But I think we want to really think about it just being integral. So what does it look like for everybody in the church family from 0 to 99 to be moving, growing, discipled, sanctified together?
So that's interesting. So, and I'll ask you about Avenue in just a moment, how it works there, Joel. But it sounds like you're saying a really thought through youth work doesn't actually start with let's appoint someone, or let's choose this material, or let's run that group. It actually starts with a right understanding of the church and having a vision for church ministry. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes in kids and youth ministry, we talk about having kind of a strategy for the 0 to 18. So over your 18 years, what...
Don't bang the table, by the way.
Sorry.
That's all right. You're getting very excited.
Yeah, too excited.
It's that Irish coming through.
The passion. What do you hope to achieve in your 18 years? But actually, that is part of the church family vision as well. So as we have children in our care, as well as we have adults, what what's the direction of travel? What would we long to see, in our young people before they leave to go to university or college or their first job, but also for our adults. So absolutely, and it's about ecclesiology. So what we think the church is.
And we don't want to spend too long on this, but it is quite interesting, and an observation I have. So the FIEC is made up of churches who would have different views on this. I guess the majority would be Baptistic and probably kind of New Covenant theology-ish, see more of a discontinuity between the covenants. But then there will be a significant minority that would be Peter Baptist and see more of a continuity between the covenants. And it strikes me that one of the things that you often see in churches of all kinds is that you see those who, like me, are Baptistic, are basically treating their children as believers, which goes sort of against our ecclesiology. And then those who are Peter Baptist actually treating their children as unbelievers. It's kind of, it's just not thought through, is it?
It's not thought through at all. And I think, we do. And it does matter, actually.
Yeah, it does
I think it matters how we see the role of parents, how we see children in the church family and in the nuclear family. And yes, to think through what we're doing, both in the material we teach, how we teach it, how we articulate it, just how we use our words to them, and what we're helping them to see of the beauty of the gospel and the glory of the church as well.
So not something for leaders to kind of abrogate and say, Bob or Sue's been appointed youth worker, they can just get on with it.
Yes.
It needs to be led from the top of the church, really.
Yeah, and just, I realise for lots of maybe pastors listening to this, that actually could be a pretty overwhelming thought of like, oh my goodness, I have to think about that now as well. But, we have the difference between kind of someone who's a little bit thoughtful and go, okay, I can see how we do need to address this, to make our youth and kids ministry actually consistent with what we believe or what we're doing in our church. To others who kind of think, well, that person's done camp once, let's just let them crack on with the kids and youth ministry.
Yes, they've got a guitar.
Yeah,
they must be qualified.
Yeah. And the thing that we see actually is what we do in children's and youth ministry often manifests in the main church about 15 years later.
Okay.
So there's a direct correlation between how we nurture children and young people into what appears then in the mainstream adult congregation. So we are, we often say the children are not just the church of the future, they're the church of now. And we want to agree
I believe
with that.
The children of the future. Treat them well.
Let them show the way.
Yes,
no,
indeed.
Let's not do that. But it's not just they are the kind of congregants of the future. They are the leaders, the elders. They will shape the future. Yeah. So this is actually critically important for where we're going.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Joel, just describe to us a little bit Avenue. So, Avenue Community Church in Leicester, people might not know it. So just describe the church to us a bit and just give us an outline of kind of what's going on in terms of kids ministry. It's obviously an odd time. We're coming out of lockdown, but what does it look like normally? Yeah.
Well, Avenue's a 16-year plant, so we meet in a church hall.
So fairly well established.
Yeah, and we've got a good number. It's probably about 100 or so, maybe 120 who attend on a Sunday. So there's a big group of children and families. It's very family. It's one of the reasons why we went, because we've got a 4 and an 8-year-old. So we went there because they could get to know other kids who are that kind of age. It's quite a good time at the moment because we're going through 1 Timothy, and the series title is about God's household. So what does it mean to be God's household? How does that fit in? And thinking about this topic, how does that fit in with the children up the 0 to 99 kind of thing? So we're moving out of that kind of lockdown stage, trying to regather the troops and things, but we're still kind of doing what we were doing during lockdown. So we had a thing on a Sunday morning, which was on Zoom for kids, called Sunday Morning Shake Up. And it was kind of just trying to engage them, because especially I noticed my kids they couldn't engage with a church service. Is difficult for them anyway, let alone when it's on Zoom in the corner and the toys are over there and all that kind of stuff. So we're kind of doing that kind of thing now, which is really nice. It's not the ages aren't necessarily separated. Everyone's just kind of all together and doing things all together, and then trying to understand how that's going to kind of work out. Because a lot of kids, especially for example my 4-year-old, almost half her life has been in lockdown, and now she doesn't know what things used to be like, so that's quite exciting. We have started a new thing. Well, we've got Alice, who's been appointed a youth and families worker very recently.
So we interviewed her, didn't we, at our recent leaders' conferences. It was lovely to hear from her. And I think she'll only be in the job about a week or something.
And wonderfully, Alice is part of one of our mentoring groups.
There you go.
Well.
Great. What a great advert. You can hear about the mentoring groups. If you listen to a previous episode of the podcast that we did with Mel, you'll hear all about mentoring.
Yeah, Alice is working in kind of trying to link the Sunday club that we do at the kind of moment when children go out and do their kind of age appropriate stuff, but also linking that with what we do in the service. So there's kind of we do like a little slot which is the all age slot, and that links into what the children are learning about in Sunday club, which is really nice for them, that it's not kind of separate. Also for parents, that we kind of have an idea about what they're talking about, and then the stuff that she's using at the moment is by Faith in Kids, and it's got a really nice handout that parents are given afterwards. So every parent can collect their kids after the service. They get the handout, they know what they've been speaking about, and then they can kind of continue it on. That's something that I think the leadership at Avenue are really thinking about. How do we help parents to do that kind of discipling work of the children during the week? And really kind of connecting that rather than...
So it sounds like that's exactly the kind of thing you're describing, Mel, which is it's holistic, it's thought through, it comes from the leaders. So Alice is obviously being tasked with delivering it, but she's not being tasked with, you just sort it out. You're the youth worker. We're concentrating on adults. It doesn't sound like that at all. That sounds like what you're describing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we are recognizing is, as we had ministry diversification of roles, so we had a kids worker, a youth worker, a women's worker, a man's worker, we've lost a vision of, particularly in children's and youth ministry and in nurturing kids and young people, of the role of the family and the role of parents, actually. And then what it means to do intergenerational ministry well. We've become a little bit segregated and separatists.
So we talk in church life about how we don't believe, let's say, in the homogenous unit principle, you want to reach all people. And then they come into church and we separate everyone off into their individual units.
And functionally, we work on the HUP principle often, particularly with kids and young people. And what we want to say is, I've trained youth and kids workers for 12 years now. So I obviously believe in kids and youth ministry, but I don't believe that they're primary disciplers of the children that are entrusted to them in the local church. Parents are. And so, whenever I talk to youth and kids workers, I just want us to see our role as supporting parents in the task of discipling their children. Now, where we need to think about that carefully is when there's unchurched kids that come in, and we can chat about that. But anything we can do to resource parents to speak about Jesus in their homes naturally is going to be brilliant. So, what Alice is doing is great. Lots of churches are moving towards what we might describe as a whole church curriculum feel. So obviously traditionally we've kind of had pre-prepared material that you buy a package and you work through that, which has served the church incredibly well. But you can sometimes, depending on the material you use, have, 2 or 3 children in 2 or 3 different groups. They're all learning something different. And then mum and dad might be learning something different as they sit in church. And then you're sending them home and they're like, we don't really know where to start.
Talk about?
So with the whole church curriculum, the vision is much more that everyone learns together. So what the adults are learning, the kids are learning, the youth will learn about. And so just as a church, again, you're traveling in the same direction. It's so easy for parents just to grab that low-hanging fruit and go, we talked about that. Did that come up in your Sunday school class?
Okay.
Or
it does sound quite a burden, though. So, I'm a beleaguered church pastor, let's say, and, life is busy anyway and draining. I feel like I'm on the edge.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm producing 2 sermons a week, morning and evening sermon. And if you're saying to me, you've got to think a bit more about, being holistic, being joined up, kids doing the same series. I'm thinking, how do I ever tackle, Revelation or Leviticus, and B, actually, I'm just thinking, I've got no capacity for that. Is it really worth it?
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I think a couple of things to respond to that is, again, kind of what do we think we're doing for families and for children to keep on thinking that through.
So if I'm the pastor, I'm not just the pastor of adults.
For the adults.
No,
exactly.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, so you're answerable for the whole congregation, actually. And sometimes we kind of think whoever's doing the kids' work or the youth work, they'll take responsibility for that, but they won't actually. I think it's not ultimate. So a whole church curriculum is not the only way of doing things, so don't feel that it is. But also to say that, when we buy material, you think, I'll have to do it the way they tell me to use it. And somehow we've become enslaved to it rather than it serving us.
Okay, yeah.
So I just say to people, like, chop it up or photocopy it and put it in the right order and use it to somehow bring everything in line. So you don't have to do it the way a curriculum has been written. you can do it in a way that serves your church family. So it's fair to say that where people are doing a whole church curriculum is mostly where there's paid workers who have a little bit of time to do this. I would love to see in the future materials designed to do this, to help pastors, where we can pick material up that is chronological.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but presumably you would think you can teach any part of the Bible to children.
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
Definitely.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just I wanted to make sure I didn't have to make you leave right away.
I know.
I mean, obviously some parts are easier than others.
Yeah, totally.
Sure, but there's no reason not to teach Leviticus to children.
No, although
in the right way.
That's right, but it is hard.
Yeah.
So for a church volunteer who, is passionate about serving the children, but actually has little training or even experience, maybe like if I said to Joel, next week you're teaching Ecclesiastes, you'd be like, give me Mark. That's where we think about how do we help resource and train our volunteer leaders. And just on that idea of whole church curriculum as well, like it's fine to do it one term and then to do something different a different term. It's just like my kind of image is let's keep pushing the envelope back to parents across the table, but every so often we just need to do.
I think as well, adults need more colouring in. That's my great conviction. Joel, how long did it take you to prepare your lesson?
I looked at some questions before we got there in the morning, before we prayed. So it wasn't very much, but it's that faith and kids stuff that's kind of prepared.
Okay.
And it did help that I listened to the kind of the preview during the service before we went out. So that was helpful. Yeah.
So what preview is that? What does that mean?
So yeah, we had a slot. We had to have a slot during the service before the kids go out to their lessons.
Okay.
So I think it was actually Alice this time who kind of taught through the story with some kind of visual aids and things.
Nice.
Which gave a preview. And then when we went through the questions, were you listening? So in the games, were you listening to what the story was? Can you answer the questions? And then in the groups,
parents are hearing it as well.
They are, exactly. Yeah. So everyone has a bit of an idea about what's going on.
That's interesting because that's not quite whole church curriculum, but
it's great.
It's doing something, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So the rest of the church know what's going on with the kids. And,
definitely. Yeah, and I think if you did work on a kind of whole church curriculum as well, that all together time, which is just church family time, can be your big opening illustration for everybody. And then you go into age appropriate kind of teaching, and then you come back together. I think that's one of the things to think through as well, as we've got into the habit of using kind of material that we've bought. They often demand you're out for an hour or you're out for an hour and 15 minutes. And that's another issue in terms of thinking about how our children understand what church is. Because, you'll see the kind of first song kind of starting up and they're gathering their stuff up ready to get out. And then when we do bring them in, it's often for what we describe as an all age service, which is kind of as different as possible from their normal church experience.
Don't get me started. We're going to record later on today and for later publication an episode just on children in church, because I think it's such a big issue. Yeah. That actually we're going to have a slightly more provocative talk about that. I think you and I might have some similar views, even though we come from different ecclesiology. But anyway, we'll leave that. We'll just trail that. We'll leave it hanging for a future episode. I guess both of you really, the majority of youth and children's work in church is done by people like Joel, who are, perhaps their parents. They're basically. Well, I don't mean to disparage you by calling you a well-meaning volunteer, Joel, but,
I am well-meaning.
But they're not paid by the church, they're not set apart by the church. They've probably got limited time, they've probably got holding down a full-time job, looking after the kids.
Yes.
That's true, isn't it? The majority of the work is done by people like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
How do we, I was going to say, how do we train people like that? But I think, how do we as leaders even embrace the idea that training is necessary? We're so happy to, so our church, we've got, I think we would have, if everyone was there, we'd have 70 adults, 50 kids, 45 kids maybe. And I think we're just so happy to have someone's name on the rota sometimes. You just think, phew, there's someone to do the group. That actually, then saying to people, you've got to come to a training session, or you've got to do this, you've got to do that, just feels like we're putting a burden on people. How can church leaders realistically embrace that sort of culture of training for people like Joel and for me, I guess, in a local church, to be helped to teach children well?
Yeah. I think unfortunately in the UK, our commitment to training volunteer leaders is pretty low. So
across the board, that's right. It's
across the board.
Not just children's and youth
Absolutely.
ministry, is
it? Yeah. And it's interesting, even you are saying kind of how the burden is big. How do we help manage the burden? But actually, I often think that as we offer training and equipping, we need to change the narrative of, we're delighted you're taking this responsibility, but it is responsibility. And we don't want to say kind of, just do your least and get through this. We want to say, this is a privilege and this is a joy, and we're going to commit to equipping you. I wonder if so many people feel that it's a burden is because you are sent out with like, what do I do here? Someone's given me the book or the material and I have to make it up from there.
So actually the lack of training makes the burden...
Perpetuates the burden.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
It makes it heavier, I think. I also think that we've kind of, again, we've run on a pattern of, we'll have a big day event and that's where you're expected to go for training. And it's a bit scattergun in that, there'll be all sorts of things and we hope something will hit everybody, but it's not really bespoke and intentional. So trying to, again, think about how you train and who trains your teams. I also think we're way too ambitious. So we'll think we'll do a training morning. Whereas really I have a vision for, every time you meet with your team, which hopefully is every half term, just do 15 minutes, like read a chapter of a book. So slow, steady, building up to equip volunteer leaders and to give them confidence in what they're doing.
It might be important as well when people are volunteering to do it to make sure they're aware that there's that responsibility as well.
Absolutely.
And to say we'd like you to commit to doing this meeting once a half term or reading this book or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. So lots of, again, this is more in paid situations with paid workers, but youth and kids workers will sign their volunteer leaders up to a contract, which sounds very formal, but it's more just to help everyone know where they stand. So this is the expectation of you. This is when you can get out of this, So, because I think for lots of Sunday school teachers, particularly feel eternally trapped. They got on the rota in 1989.
But especially when there's no one else to come in. There's
exactly.
sort of a guilt-inducing perseverance.
And to say, I expect you to be at this, or I'd love you to read this book, or and that's working really well. And actually, again, it's people feeling that they are cared for and loved and served well, rather than that kind of, you're on that rota, off you go.
So perhaps part of our problem with training is that we immediately think, we're talking about sending someone off on a 6-month course. Whereas actually it's just a little and often.
Slow and steady and little, just to help people think. And there are, our churches are filled with brilliant volunteers, doing wonderful, wonderful jobs. And I actually think we maybe have the narrative of like, they just don't want more training or they don't want another meeting. But actually, if we talk to them, they might. And, when I was in full-time kind of church-based ministry, often did our training around a celebration meal or a nice breakfast. And, come on a Saturday morning, we'll be done in an hour. Enjoy a nice breakfast and have the rest of your day. How do we make it a joy and a pleasure for people to be together and to love one another as a team?
And in terms of things that you might want to train people in, I guess, when you've got a limited amount of time, you tend to think, what are the priorities? And you think, well, I've got to do safeguarding.
Yes.
Okay, I'm legally obliged to do my safeguarding training, so I do that. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to imply that safeguarding is unimportant, but we sort of tend to think, what are the things I've got to do? Okay, I've got to do safeguarding. And then perhaps, it might take people through the material.
Yeah, how to use the material.
Yeah, but actually there's great usefulful,ness, isn't there, in a greater breadth of training?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what sorts of other topics are useful to cover off with what Joel? What we can ask you as well. What do what would you like? What does Joel need?
Yeah,
we're setting him up here as our newbie. So what does? There you are. You can see him. What does Joel need now? He's got this great responsibility in church.
So I think he was with 8 to 11. So something about how 8 to 11s grow spiritually, what's going on developmentally with them, how to spot if there's a developmental thing that you might see wrongly spiritual, or vice versa, a spiritual thing that you might actually think, oh, well, that's just developmental. How to have the right level of conversation with them. Often we find people that are particularly teaching below the level of the kids and young people that they have been given to.
Why do people do that?
Just inexperience often. And also because lots of our age groups are big, so you'll have 5 to 9s in one, Avenue is probably slightly unusual.
So there's quite a difference between a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old.
Yes, and people will think, well, the 9-year-olds at least know how to sit and behave, but the 5-year-olds will lose focus if I don't keep them engaged. And so we teach, I think, unhelpfully to the younger end, when actually we need to be teaching to the older end and kind of dragging the littlies along with us. And Piper has a lovely saying, which is, give kids big truths to grow into rather than little truths to grow out of.
Nice. I've not heard that before, but it's a great
it's kind of
phrase,
like that, that school blazer image that you get your school blazer in first year and it's like 5 sizes too big, but by the time you get to 6th year it fits you perfectly. And it's that kind of image of like, just keep giving them something to grow into. And I wonder if I fear if we sometimes are giving young people a childhood faith rather than a childlike faith that they could grow out of.
Joel, you're signed up already, aren't you? I can tell.
Sounds great. Yeah.
There's lots of other stuff. That I could.
And presumably, we need to be talking to all our leaders about godliness all the time.
Absolutely.
We take the pastorals seriously, don't we? And we see that actually it's not just about gifting; it's about godliness. Yeah. And there's no reason why someone who's not, someone like Joel who's teaching a Sunday school class. I don't know how often will you do it, Joel? How often do you come round on the rota?
Once in every 4 maximum.
Once in every 4. So, it would be easy just to think, Joel's doing once in every 4. Let's just give him the basics of giftedness stuff. But actually, all leaders need to be encouraged to develop and grow in godliness, don't they? Yeah,
and one of the things we don't do is actually give any feedback. So, Joel, probably there wasn't many, but apart from the kids watching specifically what we were doing.
Joel's children thought it was great.
It's amazing.
Biggest fans. But I, particularly in paid workers, I love to train them to think about how do we give, edifying and helpful feedback, but again, to build and resource the team. So just kind of, not on the day, but a few days later, having a coffee and saying 2 things I thought you did brilliantly, and 1 thing I wonder if we could work on for the next time. Again, that's easier when there's a paid worker or just someone dedicated to be, the classical term, your Sunday school superintendent. But how do we just look at upskilling all the time together, growing?
What about, we just mentioned very briefly earlier about non-church children. What about groups where there are non-church children? I guess especially midweek groups. It's probably these days less likely to be Sunday groups, isn't it? But probably more likely to be midweek groups where there are non-church children. And you've often got this sort of quite sharp distinction, haven't you, between those who come from Christian families, they know all the answers, and those who have got no idea, and you sort of mix them all together. What should we be thinking about in terms of training people for that sort of ministry, where they've got this sort of mixed crowd in front of them, I guess? And
actually, particularly when we get to teenagers, they separate. So you often have the Christian kids coming on a Sunday, but the others on a Friday, and so they're not mingling properly. I think it is particularly understanding the worldview and the philosophical air that those children and young people, all of our children and young people, are being raised into.
Even from a very young age?
Absolutely, from a very young age.
So they're getting a worldview from Peppa Pig and Hey Duggee and everything else?
And from parents and from grandparents and from, school, nursery, daycare.
Did you see the way that I slipped in the Hey Duggee
That's the best one.
There. You're impressed with that, right?
Bluey as well. Bluey's really great. Seen that.
Good knowledge. Absolutely. And, we are in what's described as a post-Christian era. So some of the children that we would have the privilege of encountering in those groups are 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation non-church going families. So, if we're, when we're teaching and what we're teaching really matters, they don't understand the biblical meta-narrative. They don't have the grand sweep of scripture. So we can't teach something from Matthew and refer to Isaiah, because they'll be like, hang on a second, what is going on here? They sadly know Jesus and God as swear words. And so I think there's a real skill to reaching and engaging with those young people. Yeah. And what often happens then is to the detriment of our own young people. So we focus exclusively on evangelism and we forget the discipleship. So our own kids are sitting there going, I've heard this week after week after week, and we're not pushing them on in discipleship. So there's a real skill needed. And again, I don't want to frighten anyone off, because we rejoice that we have a sovereign God who is still calling boys and girls and men and women to himself, which as we remain in history. But he has given us wisdom, his word, and understanding to try and think carefully about how we do this.
I'm thinking as you're talking, my gut reaction would be, this is a young person's game in terms of delivering youth work. I'm wrong about that, aren't I?
Absolutely, yeah. Particularly youth work. They're longing for authentic people before them. And so I think actually, one of the things we need to work on is recovering the intergenerational nature of church. And so having people from every stage and age in our church family as represented in both kids and youth work is really important. People who have lived long lives and have loved Jesus and have raised children Christianly, to give them that aspiration of that's what kind of long life serving Jesus can look like. Someone who's had a later conversion and actually can talk about that worldview shift of, I used to believe that, but now this is what I've come to believe as I've, sat under the authority of Scripture, the teaching.
So it's great, if I was the pastor of Avenue, I'd be delighted that Joel was, signing up, because obviously he's a young guy, slightly younger than he looks, and I'd be delighted in that. But actually, I should be encouraging people of all ages and saying to them, you've got something to give. And I guess the immediate response is, I've done this for many years, or, the younger people will be better at it. But actually, I need to be able to say to people that, no, actually, we need you. You've got something to give. Yeah.
And in terms of, really simply a Titus 2 model, someone is always the older and the younger brother or sister. And so even if it is just someone coming to kind of sit and colour or, do a craft or, and that you don't expect everybody to do everything, but to prize the responsibility and the involvement that we could give to church family members. Yeah.
Joel, just a final question for you. Next time it comes around in 4 weeks' time, whatever it is, apart from getting slightly better with a parachute, what kind of inputs do you think you would value and benefit from?
In terms of being trained to be helped? I guess it would be knowing the kind of extra questions maybe to pop in.
Yep.
So obviously you have the kind of the set out questions, but sometimes they're quite closed. Mm-hmm. So it can be, what happened? This happened. Okay.
Yes.
And having a little bit of kind of input into where are we? Where do we want to kind of go to? With that would be quite helpful. I mean, I managed to get some of those bits in here and there. But yeah, that would be helpful. And I suppose as well, one thing that really stood out to me was one of the children who was in my group was very, very quiet, but he had some really great things to say, and you probably wouldn't have heard him, and the others didn't hear, so you'd have to kind of repeat and stuff. So how to engage those who are more quiet, but probably because they're thoughtful or shy, but they still have something very useful to contribute, or maybe an interesting question that needs to be answered.
Yeah. So how to manage group dynamic, how to shush the loud ones and encourage the quiet ones.
Yeah. Yes.
And then I think
which sounds like the FIEC podcast.
With the
be quiet, Adrian.
With the questions, is like what I love to think about is how do we get to their hearts? And often pre-prepared material makes that trickier because it's not written knowing our children and young people. Yeah. Okay. And I think sadly that's one of the downsides of our rota-based system is that. Again, that doesn't hugely facilitate that intimate knowledge of kids and young people. But yes, to think about how we apply to their heart and look for signs of spiritual life, I think.
Mel, that's a great way to end. We're trying to colloquially, we're trying to get to their hearts, aren't we? We want their hearts to be changed. We want them to be softened. We want them to trust in Christ, and that's the ultimate aim, isn't it? Of all the ministry we're doing and discipleship work we're doing. Thanks very much, Mel, and thanks, Joel, and thanks for being our sort of whipping boy to a certain extent. We've beaten you up a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but we trust you'll get on well with your little group as well.
I can't wait.
And thanks for joining us on the FIEC podcast. You can, if you haven't already subscribed through all the normal ways. My name's Adrian Reynolds. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Mel, and thanks, Joel.
Thank you.